Hello, welcome to Raymond Castile's Basement of Horror. This will be a light episode. We're going to look at one item, just one item, and explore that item. I think after all the programs that we did in the days leading up to Halloween, it's okay to have a light episode this week. My schedule's very, very tight this week, so I have to do a light episode of Basement of Horror. Next week we'll have a more ponderous episode, I promise. So, the item we're going to look at is in this bag. I think you can tell what it is already. Ta-da! This is the Aladdin 1979 Universal Monsters Lunchbox. It's got beautiful artwork of all the Universal monsters on every side. And we'll take a closer look later on. Then inside is a bunch of plastic bags and paper. Well, that's not the way you would have bought it at the store. This is all here to protect this lovely thing. The thermos. We'll look at the thermos again a little bit later. Let's put this stuff down here. We'll do a up-close look at this in a minute. But this is a classic monster collectible. The special thing, I mean, there's lots of special things about this, but the thing that comes to mind, I think, is really makes this kind of a landmark, is as a kid, I was certainly aware that there were the Universal monsters, and then there was Hammer Horror, and there were these different companies, but I don't remember thinking of the Universal monsters as a kind of shared universe, like the Marvel shared universe. I don't remember thinking. It's kind of, I think I just took it for granted. I had my Ahai monsters, and I knew they were all universal. They were linked. I knew that, but I don't think I really took stock as a kid. I don't think I took stock of the fact that these were all together in what today we would call a shared universe. And this lunchbox really brings it all together. I can't think of a time, any kind of merchandising, any promotion. I can't think of anything else that called the monsters, that branded them as the Universal monsters. People made toys of these characters, and they were copyright Universal Studios, but I don't remember a product line or any kind of item that branded them all like under the umbrella of the Universal monsters before this Lunchbox. And this calls them the Universal movie monsters. But it's almost like this Lunchbox defines the universe, the Universal Monsters universe. For the first time, it gives you the rundown. Like, these are the characters in the Universal Monsters universe, and shows them all, including things that generally were not lumped together at that time, like Phantom of the Opera and Metaluna Mutant. You didn't see those grouped together very often. Tarantula and Mole Man, we'll get a better shot of that later. The only character here that's not on model is Igor. I don't know what Igor that is. That seems to be kind of a generic hunchback, like a Frankenstein assistant, Dr. Frankenstein's hunchback assistant. But it's not a particular one from the movies as far as I can tell. I mean, I don't know, maybe that's supposed to be vaguely a Dwight Fry character? Not really. I don't know, it's not, it's obviously not the Hunchback of Notre Dame. And it's not Bela Lugosi's Igor. So it's kind of a generic, it's really the only generic character on the Lunchbox. And it's sort of a stand-in for the Hunchback, who's not represented here. And I don't know why they didn't just call him, Quasimodo or something. I think that would have been better, because obviously he's got a hunched back. But he's the only character on this Lunchbox that isn't specific to the films and isn't a great likeness of the character on screen. Even Dracula, which he looks like maybe he's slightly generic. I don't know if there were any licensing from the actors or their estates. I don't know if there's anything like that with this Lunchbox. I don't see any copyrights for the actors. I just see Universal Studios. It's not like Chaney Estate or Karloff Estate or Lugosi Estate. But I can tell they fudged a little bit on Dracula. It's not quite Lugosi, but it's close enough. It's not so far off that it's a vanilla kind of a generic Dracula. It's obviously the Universal Dracula. And you could chalk it up to just being a kind of stylized likeness of Lugosi. It's not so far off. Not like some of the modern or later depictions of Dracula are just so far off from Lugosi. You can tell that they're trying to avoid the Lugosi likeness. That's not the case here. It's basically Lugosi, but they're just fudging it just a little bit, making it slightly generic to try to get away from upsetting Bela Jr. and getting a lawsuit, because he was already well underway with his crusade against Universal using his father's likeness without his permission, without him getting a piece of it. That started in the 60s. So this is 1979, so that was well underway. We'll go over this character by character. But I just feel like it's so interesting that this is almost like a Rosetta Stone for the Universal Monster universe, that this Lunchbox really summarizes that this is the shared universe. These are the characters. These are the Universal Monsters. And this is like a checklist for the first time, where something that wasn't coming from the fans or from an observer, like something maybe Forey Ackerman might have wrote in Famous Monsters or something like that. This is coming from the source, from Universal Studios, a product they're putting out to the public that's saying these are the Universal Monsters. It's not just like a coincidence that we happen to make a Frankenstein movie, and we happen to make a creature movie, and we happen to make mole people movie, and we just happen to make these horror movies. No. This is a official shared universe, and these are the characters who are who live together in this universe. And here they are all on this lunchbox. And that is, I can't think of a time of any earlier example of Universal putting that out there before this lunchbox. I'm sure there was something, I'm sure. But this got a lot of visibility. A lot of kids saw this. And in 1979, it's coming kind of late in the monster craze. Obviously, there was the 60s monster craze, which was like roughly 61 to 66, thereabouts, kind of early mid-60s. And then that subsided, and everyone was into space for a while. And then in the early 70s, around 72, there was a second monster craze that kind of lasted until around 76-ish, thereabouts, early mid-70s. And then it kind of subsided, and everyone was into $6 Million Man, and then Star Wars. So in 79, this is kind of late in the game. This is coming kind of late. But just around the corner would be the Remco monsters. So something was brewing. Even though Star Wars was the big thing, something was brewing. The monsters kind of made a little comeback, because then you had the Remco monsters, the 9-inch, or is it 10-inch? It's 9-inch, I think. Remco monsters, and then the mini monsters, and all the other Remco stuff they made at the time. And then you had Tomland coming out with their second series, Glow Monsters, that had the Universal style characters. And you had a lot of, and you had Don Post doing a little wave of Universal characters, I think like in the early 80s, thereabouts, because they'd kind of gotten away from that for a while in the 70s. So there was a little wave of Universal monster merchandising right around that time, 79, 80, 81, 82, right around there. There was another little wave. And then we'd get another one around 86, just a little one like with the Imperial monster toys, which we'll show on this program eventually. And then it was kind of quiet for a while. Really until the late 90s. There wasn't another big push for Universal monsters for another decade into the late 90s. So the timing of these waves is interesting periodically. I don't know if it's Universal decides, okay, now we're going to push the monsters again, or if it comes from the outside merchandisers, the companies say we want to do Universal monsters, or if it's a little bit of both. Well, let's talk a little bit about Aladdin. That's the company that made this. There had been Lunchboxes for a long time. I'm not going to get into the whole history of Lunchboxes. I mean, they go way back. I think even like in the 1920s, there were illustrated lunchboxes for children. But Aladdin got into the licensing business in the 1950s with Hopalong Cassidy. That was their first big licensed lunchbox. And it was a metal lunchbox, and it just had a little sticker of Hopalong Cassidy on it. I think it was red, and it had a little sticker of Hopalong Cassidy. And that's generally regarded as the first big hit with licensed lunchboxes. Now, there were some Disney lunchboxes prior to that. Aladdin didn't make them, I don't think. There was a different company. But that Hopalong Cassidy lunchbox is considered a landmark that really started the trend of licensed character lunchboxes that focused more on television, certainly with Hopalong Cassidy, television, and then movies, and whatever was in popular culture at the time. The idea that that kids would replace their lunchbox every year because they would want the latest characters on the lunchbox. So if they were a fan of a particular TV show one year, they wouldn't necessarily still be watching that TV show the next year, so they'd want a new lunchbox. And that would be a way to get them to keep buying new lunchboxes, even though these things are made of metal. They don't really, unless you abuse them, they don't really wear out. So there's no reason for someone to replace it, except a matter of fashion, of style. That you don't want last year's lunchbox, you want this year's lunchbox with the whatever's in this year. If Hopalong Cassidy is out, then I don't know, maybe Lone Ranger or Gunsmoke or Have Gun Will Travel or something is in this year. So by the 70s, it was really kind of winding down. And really, like, metal lunchboxes, I think, when did they go out? I think mid-80s we saw the final metal lunchboxes. They were already on their way out for several years, but by mid-80s they were gone, and instead they had plastic lunchboxes. And there is a plastic version of this. I think it's not a U.S. issue. I want to say it's maybe Canadian, but I'm not sure about that. But there is a plastic version, but it doesn't have all the artwork. I think it might only have one panel of artwork. I'm not sure. I don't own it. I don't know much about it. It's much rarer, much more rare than the standard original metal U.S. version. But this metal, I mean, we almost didn't get this. It really came out towards the end of the era of the metal lunchbox. And there's different theories about why they switched from metal to plastic. Sort of the urban legend is that kids were using the metal lunchboxes to beat each other over the head, and parents got concerned, and so the metal lunchboxes were banned, and they had the safer plastic lunchboxes instead. But I think that's been debunked. I don't think that's really what happened. From what I've read, most likely the changeover happened because the plastic lunchboxes were just cheaper to produce than metal. And this isn't just printed on. These things, the artwork is in what I think is called bas relief. The artwork is raised from the surface. It's sticking out. So it's like it's embossed. It's not on the side, but on the front and back. The artwork, like the outlines of the faces, are sticking up from the background. So they had to be pressed. So they had to do the printing, the lithography, and then press those shapes. So it was a lot of expense to make these things. And the plastic versions, the plastic lunchboxes, were cheaper to produce. So that's probably why they switched from metal to plastic. So it's kind of odd, the timing. We almost didn't. Really, you would think that this would have come from the 60s, from the heyday of the original 60s monster craze. But it came from the end of the 70s, almost into the 80s. I do remember seeing this as a kid. I never owned it as a kid. I do remember seeing it. I don't know why I didn't own it, because it's not like I controlled the purse strings in my family. I certainly didn't. I did use a lunchbox in school, but I remember I did have a Dino De Laurentiis King Kong lunchbox, so I had a metal lunchbox. But most of my childhood and my teenage years, I had a plastic, kind of grown-up looking lunchbox with no pictures on it, just a plastic dark gray lunchbox, had the dome top, like something like an adult would take to work. And it had two little latches that flipped up and opened up, and had a more kind of a grown-up thermos. So only for small window of time did I have a kitty kind of lunchbox, and it was a Dino De Laurentiis King Kong lunchbox, which I still got somewhere. It's in terrible shape. It's not really in collectible condition, but I still have it somewhere. So let's take a closer look at this lunchbox. On the front, we see the Glenn Strange Frankenstein. And he really is the Frankenstein for the 60s monster craze. A lot of the merchandise was based on Glenn Strange more than Karloff. You had Karloff likenesses as well, but Glenn Strange really was the 60s Frankenstein. And then we have the Bride of Frankenstein, and I like that she has red hair, like Elsa Lanchester. Elsa had red hair. And it's nice that they have that level of authenticity. You would think they'd make her hair black or brown or whatever, but no, it's red, just like her real hair. And they even get her stitches right, like the stitches on her neck. It's not generic. I mean, it's all movie accurate. I like that. We discussed Igor. He's the only really generic character on the box. He's kind of a hunchback, sort of half hunchback and half Dr. Frankenstein assistant. Kind of a conglomeration of a few different characters. He's sort of the Dwight Fry assistant, and he's sort of Lugosi Igor, and he's sort of Quasimodo, all rolled into one. And it looks like they're in a dungeon with cobwebs. Then on the other side, we only have two monsters. We have Dracula and the Wolfman. And it's interesting that they depict Dracula without his medallion. I wonder if there's a reason for that. Also, Dracula has white opera gloves, which he typically did not have. I mean, I don't know if maybe in the opera, because he actually does visit an opera in one scene. I don't remember if he might have gloves in that. I don't think so. I don't think he ever had gloves like that in the movie. I could be wrong. And then we have this beautiful picture of Lon Chaney Jr. as the Wolfman, which is based on an actual still. I mean, both of these images are based on stills of these characters. Even though the Dracula takes some liberties with the likeness, it's still based on a still. And Wolfman's definitely based on a still. And the Wolfman really looks like Lon Chaney Jr. That's a very good painting of Lon. I mean, those are his eyes for sure. Now let's look at the top. We have this plastic Aladdin handle, and it's one of the only plastic elements in this whole thing. I mean, the thermos is plastic, but the lunchbox itself, I don't know if there's any other plastic besides the handle. I think that's it. It's kind of hard to see because of this handle, but we'll try to get a look at it. We have the scientist from Tarantula, and he's just called Tarantula as if he were the tarantula, but that's the name of the movie. And I remember as a kid, when I saw that character on the lunchbox, that kind of freaked me out, because that character always freaked me out. Yeah, that movie, Tarantula, scared me. And that scene where he's revealed, the scientist is revealed in his final stage of deformation, that really scared me. But it was also interesting that he's shown here in his lab coat, because that's also from a still, a photograph from the movie. There's a still of him, probably a series of stills, where he's wearing this lab coat, even though in the movie, when he looked like this, he was in his pajamas. He in the movie, he's never wearing a lab coat when he's in his final form, all disfigured like this. But I always thought, as a kid, I thought that was kind of surprising that they would put such a grisly image on the lunchbox. I mean, it kind of put you off eating your lunch as a kid. Now, I mean, with everything kids see now, it probably wouldn't make any difference. But back then, that was kind of shocking. Then we got the Mole Man. And again, that's just a character I'd never even thought about. That's a character I just didn't give any thought to as a kid. But here he is on the lunchbox. Now let's look over here. Here's the Mummy, and of course, at this time, anytime you saw the Mummy, it was always Lon Chaney Jr. as Karis or Carice. I mean, you never saw Karloff as Imhotep in any merchandise. It was always Lon Chaney Jr. And as a kid, Lon Chaney Jr. was the Mummy for me as a kid. Nowadays, they always use Karloff. Karloff as Imhotep. So it's kind of cool to. It's always cool to see the vintage Mummy merchandise with the Lon Chaney Jr. image, because I wish we'd get that again. I wish we'd see Lon Chaney Jr. on the merchandise again. Now on the bottom, we've got the creature from the Black Lagoon. And as popular as he is, I'm surprised that he ends up on the bottom. I mean, I'm surprised. See, this is the thing. Until more recent years, the creature always got the short end of the stick. He was always the character they either didn't make at all, or he was underproduced, or he was kind of sidelined, as he is here on the bottom. I think there was the perception that he was a lesser member of the Universal Monsters. He was sort of an also-ran, a black sheep. He wasn't up there with the main characters like Frankenstein, Dracula, Wolfman, Mummy, and that's changed now. So I think if a lunchbox if a lunchbox like this were made today, I suspect the creature would be featured more prominently. And then we have the Phantom of the Opera and the Metaluna Mutant. Or how do they pronounce it in the movie? They call him a mutant or something like that in the movie. It's weird. He's a mutant, Metaluna Mutant. And here again, these are two characters that, I mean, yeah, you saw the Phantom depicted. Like, there was the Aurora model kit of the Phantom. There was a Don Post Phantom. There was a Lincoln Phantom action figure, and there would be a Remco Phantom. So, okay, the Phantom you saw in the Marx figurine, of the Phantom. But the Mutant, you never saw anything with the Mutant. There was a Don Post mask and not much else. So the Metaluna Mutant was just a character that you hardly ever saw. And it's interesting that well, I mean, he's fairly close to the film likeness, but they took some liberties. He's got a nose, and his mouth is kind of stylized, and he's not exactly like what he looks like in the movie. Phantom looks pretty much like he does in the movie. In this painting, he has eyebrows, and in the movie, he did not have eyebrows. But other than that, this is a very good likeness of Lon Chaney Sr. as the Phantom. So I think that finishes our tour all over the lunchbox. Let's take a look at the thermos. And I have to say that the thermos is something I don't look at very often. So this is kind of interesting for me to already. I'm noticing things just right now. I'm noticing things that I don't usually think of with this thermos. Some interesting things are revealed. Let's start with the Wolfman. That's a cool image of the Wolfman. It's not really from any particular film that I can tell. It's not an exact likeness of Lon Chaney Jr. It's kind of a generic take on the Wolfman, but it's still cool. Now this creature, this is Revenge of the Creature, Whereas on the Lunchbox, it's the creature from the Black Lagoon. This is Revenge of the Creature. It says creature from the Black Lagoon, but the image is from Revenge of the Creature. Then we have Glenn Strange again as the Frankenstein monster. As I said, really, in most merchandise in the 60s and 70s, Glenn Strange was the model they used for Frankenstein. Now, this is really interesting. I forgot all about this, but the mummy on the thermos is not Karloff as Imhotep. It's not Cheney as Karis. And you know, so every time I say that name, it's different. It's Karis, Karis. Because even in the movies, they say it differently every time. Because I noticed I was watching The Mummy's Hand, and I think it was the other one I saw, The Mummy's Ghost on Svengoolie. And in the movies, every time someone says his name, they pronounce it a different way. Because I was thinking, if I'm going to be talking about that character in some videos this season, and I want to make sure I get the name correct. So I was particularly paying attention to that. And it didn't help at all, because every time a character said his name, they pronounced it a different way. So I say Karis. Whatever. You can say Karis. Whatever. I don't care. I'm going to say Karis. But this is not Karis. This is not Imhotep. This is Claris. This image is from Abbott and Costello Meet the Mummy. This is Claris, and I forgot all about that. I didn't know that they had any Claris merchandising before the Imperial Toys figure of the Mummy, almost a decade later, which was based on Claris, and you'll see that figure on this program at some point. But this might be the first time that I'm aware of that anyone merchandised Claris from Abbott and Costello Meet the Mummy. It just says Mummy. It doesn't say Karis, Claris, Imhotep. It doesn't say, it just says Mummy, just like it did on the metal lunchbox. Okay, moving along, we got the Phantom of the Opera again. Basically the same image that was on the metal lunchbox. We've got Count Dracula, and he looks funny. There's definitely a Bela quality to that face, but it's almost like Count Von Count from Sesame Street. It's definitely stylized and kind of funny looking. He's got pointy ears. And he sort of has pointy ears on the lunchbox too. And that takes us all the way around. Again, it's 1979, Universal City Studios. All rights reserved. Let's see. I don't know if I've ever opened this. Oh, yeah, here we go. And it is plastic. Some of these had a glass interior, like I believe the one that came with the King Kong lunchbox had a glass interior, because at some point when I was a kid, my thermos, the glass inside the thermos broke, and I opened the thermos and it was all shattered glass inside my thermos. It was lunch hour at school, and I opened it up to pour a drink, and it was glass because it had gotten bumped or something and the glass broke. So if that wasn't the King Kong one, I don't know which one that might have been. But I had a thermos in childhood that had a glass interior, and for really the first 25 years or so of these character lunchboxes, the interior of the thermos was always glass. But around this time, it started switching to plastic, which was a lot safer. We'll deal with that. And I like the green color. Isn't that nice? Very monster green. So this is quite a set. I think that this is underrated. That's an underrated set. This lunchbox and the thermos, I think they're underrated. It's not cheap, but it's not really that expensive either. I didn't talk about the condition. This condition of this is really nice, but there's just a little bit of wear on the top here, along the edge of the top. It's just got a touch of wear, and there's just a little, little this, little that. There's a little dent on the bottom of the side with Dracula and Wolfman. So it's not perfect, but it's better than a lot of the ones you see. So it's a pretty decent condition example of this thing. Pretty decent condition. And the inside's interesting. It's got some kind of safety precautions from the National Safety Council. I don't know what all that's about. It's like crossing the road, and it's nothing to do with lunch. It's just like general, life safety precautions, like when you're on the playground, when you're crossing the street, and all that kind of stuff. And it's got this metal thing, and I guess that was supposed to be where you'd put the thermos, and for a long, kind of hold it in place. And for a long time, really until this video, that's the way I had it stored. But I noticed that it was sort of warping the lid from the pressure of that wire inside. So you can see the lid's kind of crooked a little bit. It's because of that. So I said, I'm not going to store it like that anymore. So that's why I put the plastic bags and everything in there so I could store the thermos apart from, I didn't have to snap this thermos in there, and I could have the thermos like in the middle here, and then hopefully that will solve the problem of the thing getting warped, because I don't want this to get warped. This is a pretty nice example. Not the best you'll ever see. I'm sure there are better examples out there, but it's pretty good. I'm happy with it. And I've had this a long time. I've had this, probably 20 years. I don't know if I bought this in the 90s or the early 2000s. Wasn't later than that, though. So I've had a long time. And I think it's, if you're a monster collector and you have your classic pieces like the Marx Frankenstein robot or the Renzi car that we showed in an earlier episode, stuff like that, I think this is right up there. It's not worth the same dollar value. It's only worth about, I guess, the low side, I think it'd be like $50. High side would be maybe $200. Because there was a tag. If they're really, really super mint, there's a tag. I don't know what the tag says, but there's a tag that kind of ties. It's tied, I think, with a string. So it feels like super, super, super mint. With the tag and everything, I could see maybe $200. If it's kind of beat up and some wear and rust, which this is not, but if it were all rusty, maybe $50. This, I think, is on the high end of condition. It's not mint, but it's pretty darn good. So it's not on the same level price-wise as like a Marx Frankenstein or a Renzi car or some of those things. It's not like that, but I think in terms of importance and its iconic quality, it is on a par with those things. I think if you're a monster collector, classic monster collector, you really ought to have this Lunchbox on your shelf with your monster collection. Unless you're like me and you don't have anything on a shelf, and then just put it in a box and store it away. But you ought to have it in your collection. It's a really cool piece that takes you back to a certain time, especially if you lived during that time. This takes you right back, because I actually had metal lunchbox as a kid, and I remember all the kids had them, and that's something you just don't see anymore. It doesn't exist anymore. Now kids they have like soft containers that are, I don't know what kind of what they're made of, but it's a soft material, and they put them in their backpacks, and nothing like this anymore. But that's okay. We had it. We enjoyed it. Okay, that's it. The Universal Monsters Lunchbox 1979 from Aladdin, based in Nashville, Tennessee. Hope you enjoyed looking at the Lunchbox, and I'll see you again next week with another episode of Basement of Horror. Till then, remember, he who dies with the most lunchboxes is still dead.